Hi again, I'm Ewan. Or, well, just hi if you haven't seen the first part. But if you haven't seen the last part, I would recommend watching it. But I mean, feel free to just skip it if you're not that bothered, because this video should, fingers crossed, just be fine by itself. During this video, I'm going to cover the history of sitcoms through the 70s all the way through the end of the 90s, covering the history of various sitcoms that I feel are representative of that period. The first show that we're going to cover is the Brady Bunch. The Brady Bunch focuses on the blended family of Mike and Carol Brady. After Mike is widowed, he marries Carol, who is also assumed to be widowed, and his sons Greg, Peter and Bobby now have three sisters, Carol's children, Marcia, Jan and Cindy. The show also includes Mike's live-in housekeeper, Alice, and the boy's dog, Tiger. The girls also have a cat in the pilot, but the cat doesn't seem to appear in any later episodes. Mike is an architect, and the show is set in a two-story house that he designed in an LA suburb. The first season of the show mainly deals with the characters, specifically the kids, adjusting to their new blended family, but this is mostly resolved by the end of that first season. And the remainder of the show focuses more on standard plots around family and growing up. The show also has a distinct lack of social commentary, despite the show releasing during the peak of the Vietnam War, and this allowed the show to be a source of escapism for its American audience. In 1966, the creator of Gilligan's Island, Sherwood Schwartz, wanted to create a new show after realizing that 30% of marriages in the US include at least one child from a previous marriage. He then began work on a pilot for that idea, then called Mine and Yours, which was actually very similar to the final show, with the main difference being that Carol is divorced in that version. But after the network objected to her being divorced, they settled on it having be left unsaid what happened to her previous husbands, with the idea being that the audience would be left to assume that Carol was widowed. Schwartz pitched the idea to ABC, CBS and NBC, with all of them liking the idea, but since each of them wanted changes that Schwartz wasn't really comfortable with, he decided to shelve the project for the time being. Then in 1968, the similarly titled film Mine, Yours and Ours encouraged ABC to order episodes of the series as is. After the deal with ABC, Schwartz began on casting. At first wanting Broadway actor Bob Holliday for the main role, but the network decided on hiring TV veteran Robert Reed, in part due to their worry about Holliday's lack of on-camera experience. Schwartz would cast Florence Henderson as Carol and Ann B. Davis as Alice Nelson, but for its 6 children, they would take 264 interviews for them to find Maureen McCormick as Marcia, Eve Plum as Jan, Susan Alton as Cindy, Harry Williams as Greg, Christopher Knight as Peter, and Mike Lukenland as Bobby. During the Brady Bunch's original run, it wasn't ever really a massive hit in terms of either critical acclaim or ratings, but it was incredibly successful in syndication, leading to the Brady Bunch's return to TV on 4 occasions, with the Brady Bunch Hour from 1976 to 77, the Brady Girls Get Married in 1981, the Brady Brides also in 1981, A Very Brady Christmas in 1988, the Bradys in 1990, and the Brady Bunch Home Movies in 1995. MASH following the MASH film, which was based on the book by Richard Hooker, was set during the Korean War and is a comedy ensemble set around the US Army Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. For the first 3 seasons, the show's ensemble cast included Alan Alda as Surgeon Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, Wayne Rogers as Surgeon Captain Trapper John McIntyre, McLean Stevenson as Company Commander Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, Loretta Swit as Head Nurse Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan, Larry Linville as Surgeon Mayor Frank Burns, Gary Berghoff as Company Clerk Corporal Walter Eugene Radar O'Reilly, Jamie Farr as Combat Medic Corporal Maxwell Klinger, and William Christopher as Captain First Lieutenant Father John Patrick Francis Mulcahy. Although changes to much of the cast were consistent during much of the show's run, the characters of Hawkeye, Mulcahy, Houlihan and Klinger stayed for all 11 seasons. The show was a satire of the US military, often mocking the US's role in the Cold War. But since the Cold War was still ongoing, they had to skirt the line between being mocking and being labelled anti-war, especially during the first few seasons when the Vietnam War was coming to a close. Much like the cast, the writing team underwent major changes during the show's run. Comedy writer and series creator Larry Gelber left after the 4th season, and executive producer Gene Reynolds left after season 5 to be replaced by Burt Metcalfe. After these departures, the show took a new, more dramatic direction, under the influence of Alan Alda and Metcalfe. And by the start of season 8, the writing staff had been completely overhauled, which coincided with massive changes to the cast. When the Vietnam War came to an end, the storylines became significantly less political, relying more on character. And with the end of the Vietnam War, also came a heavier influence from the Korean War, incorporating pop culture references and events from the war. The writers would take great care in researching the Korean War, including taking stories from veterans of the war. And while this approach would be very successful, by season 10 they began to run out of steam, often struggling to come up with ideas that haven't already been used. Season 10 was intended to be the last, but they were convinced to have another shorter season of 15 episodes, including a 2.5-hour long finale, Goodbye, Farewell and Amen, which would end up being the most watched TV broadcast in American history with 106 million viewers. Despite the convention of a laugh track being properly established for sitcoms by this point, Gelbert and Reynolds wanted MASH to be broadcast without a laugh track. The show didn't use a live studio audience as it was set in a hospital, and many scenes, like scenes in an operating room, were far too sensitive for a laugh track to be added. CBS originally rejected the idea of not having a laugh track, but would allow the laugh track to be omitted for those operating room scenes, and the laugh track would be more subdued for season 6 onwards, as the show went down a far more dramatic path. The laugh track was omitted, however, for some international and syndicated runs of the show, including in the UK. And while the indoor scenes were filmed on a soundstage at Fox Studios, the outdoor scenes were filmed in the mountains near Malibu, using the same set they did for the film. Although, after the usual soundstage was renovated, many of the outdoor scenes were shot there too. During the production of the finale, a brush fire broke out, destroying the majority of the set, and the fire was written into the final episode as a forest fire. As well as being the highest viewed broadcast up to that point, the MASH finale would also break the record for the highest percentage of homes with TVs tuned in to watch a TV series. The high amount of viewership would mean that, apparently, plumbing systems in parts of New York broke down due to the amount of people waiting until the end of the episode to use the toilet, although this might have been an urban legend. Is not completely inaccurate, as after the show ended, around 77% of people in New York flushed their toilets. The show struggled during its first season and was at risk of being cancelled, but after the show Bridget Loves Bernie was cancelled due to religious protests because of the interfaith marriage between the title characters, MASH was moved to its spot, following All in the Family. The second season of MASH would fare much better, being the 4th highest rated show on American TV and winning the Emmy for Best Comedy. From that point on, MASH would be one of the most popular shows in the US, and even to this day it's still aired on several channels. Our next show, Fawlty Towers, focuses on the dysfunctional running of a hotel in the seaside town of Torquay in Devon by Basil and Sybil Fawlty, with the help of their waitress and assistant Polly Sherman and waiter Manuel. Basil, played by series co-writer and co-creator John Cleese, he and his wife have a loyal and stable but somewhat unhappy marriage, with Basil often trying to stand up to his wife, and he often yearns for the passion that they once had together. Basil is seen to be fearful of his wife, but regardless refers to her with sometimes quite mean nicknames. The origin of their marriage is not described in the show, and the rest of their backstories are given much more of the same treatment, although Basil does say that he served in the Korean War, often using the excuse of a recurring leg injury inflicted during the war to remove himself from some awkward situations. Basil also seems to play up his role in the war, stating that he killed 4 men, but he's not believed by his wife, as she says that he served in the catering corps. Despite his pretentiousness, Basil still achieves affection from the audience, partly through the pitiable situations he finds himself in, and his unsuccessful attempts to avoid them. Sybil, played by Perella Scales, is the often more effective manager of the hotel, often having to organise Basil so that his rude nature doesn't do too much to harm the hotel. She also often has to bail Basil out of the messes that he gets himself into. Regardless, she often avoids participating in the actual running of the hotel, leaving the others to do much of the work while she chats with customers and friends. Polly Sherman, played by Connie Bluth, the show's co-creator and co-writer along with John Cleese, is a waitress and assistant at the hotel with aspirations as an artist, but she is often left with many of the responsibilities of a manager. manager when Sybil and Basil are incapacitated. She is often shown to be the most competent of the staff, but due to her loyalty to Basil, is often found alongside him in the holes that he creates for himself. Polly's an art student, and during one episode sells a portrait of Manuel for 50p. And Polly also has a room at the hotel where she stays. Manuel, played by Andrew Sachs, is a Spanish waiter with a limited understanding of English language and customs. This leads to Manuel often frustrating Basil, and Basil would often be physically and verbally abusive towards Manuel, and Sachs would be seriously injured during the course of the show. The idea for Fawlty Towers came when John Cleese, along with the rest of Monty Python, stayed at the now demolished Glendale Hotel in Torquay while filming in the area. Cleese was fascinated by the hotel's owner Donald Sinclair, who seemed to deem the group, as well as many of the other guests, to be a complete inconvenience to his running of the hotel. Cleese and his then wife Connie Bluth would stay at the hotel after filming to research the owner and a version of what would later become the character of Basil. And a version of what would later become Basil would appear in an episode of Doctor in the House for London, a show which Cleese was writing for at the time. Cleese and Booth both put an extreme amount of effort into each script for each episode, taking up to 4 months for some episodes, and writing as much as twice the standard amount for a half-hour comedy at the time. In part due to the same amount of material, a lot of the effort was put into editing, having to trim off loads to get it down to the required time. Between the first season in 1975 and the second season in 1979, Booth and Cleese got divorced, and Booth was very unwilling to collaborate with Cleese again until being finally convinced, but would not be convinced for a third season, and she would largely retreat from public life from then on. A feature-length special was proposed by Cleese during the mid-90s. The plot was intended to follow the Fawltys, as they would be invited by their former employee Manuel to meet him and his family in his home in Barcelona. However, the plan would never go ahead, in part due to Booth being unwilling to collaborate again, but also due to Cleese's hesitance on writing a feature-length project in the Fawlty Towers style. Cheers, set in the titular bar, stars the bar's owner and bartender Sam Malone, played by Ted Danson. Sam is a former pitcher of the Boston Red Sox, whose career ended in part due to him becoming an alcoholic. The show often focuses on Sam's unsuccessful love life and his on-again, off-again relationship with Diane Chambers, and this sort of relationship would be almost mandatory for American sitcoms going forward. Diane Chambers, played by Shelley Long, is a graduate of Boston University, and during the pilot she is left by her fiancé, leading her to reluctantly become a barmaid at Cheers. In contrast to Sam, her other romantic partners are often more upper class, including Sam's later therapist, Frasier Crane. Midway through the show, Diane leaves Boston for a screenwriting career in California, but promises Sam that she'll return to Boston to marry him, but she never does. Coach, Ernie Pantuta, played by Nicholas Colasanto, is a near-senile co-bartender, a widower, and retired baseball coach. The coach is a close friend of Sam and Diane, and spends much of his time giving advice, but is unwilling to solve his own problems. Colasanto would die of a heart attack in 1985, and the character would be written out of the show. Carla Tortelli, played by Ray Perlman, is a cynical and flirtatious cocktail waitress. She begins the season being the mother of 5 children by her ex-husband Nick Tortelli, played by Dan Hedaya. During the course of the show, she has 3 further children, with the show incorporating Perlman's real-life pregnancies. She would later marry Eddie LeBeck, played by Ray Thomas, an ice hockey player who later dies in an ice show accident. Norm Peterson, played by George Wendt, is a regular of the bar. His consistent presence at the bar would result in a recurrent joke in the show that would include everyone present in the bar shouting his name and greeting. Norm has a troubled marriage with the unseen Vera and goes through a number of jobs throughout the series, finally becoming a beer taster by the end of the show. Wendt originally auditioned for a minor role for the pilot, but would subsequently be cast in a much larger role. Cliff Calvin, played by John Ratzberger, was promoted from a recurring role to the main cast for season 2. Cliff lives with his mum Esther, played by Frances Sternhagen, and is an annoying know-it-all at the bar that often gives nonsensical trivia. The psychiatrist Frasier Crane, played by Kelsey Grammer, joins the cast as a recurring character for the 3rd season as Diane's love interest, but after Diane jilts him in season 4, he becomes a bar regular and joins the main cast for season 5. Frasier later marries Lilith Sterren, played by Babe Newith, who he goes on to have a son with. After the end of Cheers, Frasier stars in his own spin-off entitled Frasier, during which he moves to Seattle. Lilith herself first appears in season 4 and joins the main cast for season 10, and she is often teased for her uptight personality. Lilith cheats on Frasier in season 11, and they got divorced during the beginning of the Frasier spin-off. Woody Boyd, played by Woody Harrelson, arrives at Cheers during season 4 when searching for his pen pal, Coach, and after Sam tells Woody about Coach's death, as Sam brings him on as a bartender. Woody, despite being not the brightest, later marries into a wealthy family and successfully runs for city council. Cheers had many owners before Sam, being opened in 1889, and Sam himself sells the bar after season 5 to the Lillian Corporation, after which he goes on a sailing trip around the world. After sinking his boat along his journey, he returns to Boston in season 6 to find the bar under the management of Rebecca Howe, played by Christy Alley. Sam begs for his job back, returning as a bartender, but he is later promoted to manager, with Rebecca returning to a previous job at the Lillian Corporation. Sam comes up with various schemes to buy back the bar, and eventually does so in season 8 for 85 cents when the Lillian Corporation finds out about insider trading of one of their executives. The insider trading was known to Rebecca, and this results in her getting sacked, and she begs Sam for a job, leading her to be hired as a hostess and an office manager. It's later discovered the parts of the bar are actually owned by the company Melvids, but after the company is purchased by Rebecca, Rebecca and Sam become co-owners of Cheers. Sam also has friendly rivalries with the competing Gary Oldtown Tavern and Melville's owner, John Allen Hill. The setting of the bar, which the show rarely leaves, allows the show to tackle various social issues, successfully tackling issues regarding addiction, class, homosexuality, and adultery. The creators of the show, Glenn Charles, Les Charles, and James Burrows, first came up with the idea of creating a show around a relationship between a working class man and an upper class woman, set in a hotel or an inn, and they considered making an American version of Fawlty Towers, setting it on a bar, as it would make it easy to implement a vast variety of characters. They then thought about revolving the show around the conflict of a new female owner taking over the bar, and this idea would eventually be used for season 6. After deciding on Boston for the show's location, they searched the phone book for a bar to base the bar on, finding the Bull and Finch pub. The bar's owner would agree on a fee of $1 to allow the show to shoot exterior shots and license the pub's image for memorabilia, and in the wake of Cheers, the Bull and Finch pub would become very popular. Fred Dyer was at one point considered to play Sam, and Sam was also intended to be a retired football player. Bill Cosby was also considered after a recommendation from the network, but they would end up casting Ted Danson, and the character would end up being changed to a former baseball player due to Danson's build. To prepare for the role, Danson was sent to bartending school, and he would also have to learn how to pretend to know about sport, not being a sports fan. The casting for Diane was fairly straightforward. Shelley Long had been recommended by various people. The only issue was getting her to audition, but once they had, that was kind of it. Although they were still involved in the show's production, they delegated the day-to-day responsibilities to various showrunners. Ken Estin and Sam Simon were appointed as showrunners for the show's 3rd season, followed by David Agnall, Peter Casey, and David Lee for the next season. They would stay on as showrunners until season 8, being replaced by Bill Steinkellner. The final season would be overseen by Tom Anderson and Daniel Sharon. Cheers went off the air in 1993 after an incredibly successful run, winning 28 Emmy Awards, including 4 for Best Comedy. Season 9 was the peak of the show's popularity, both with audiences and critics, not only winning the Emmy for Best Comedy, but also being the only season for Cheers to be the highest rated show in American television. Our next show is The Cosby Show. But before we begin, we need some important context. The earliest known allegation against Cosby came from Christina Ricci, who came forward officially against Cosby in 2005, and she alleged that in 1965, Cosby had drugged and assaulted her in his home. She said that she told her boyfriend and her daughter in the 80s, but nothing came about the incident. In 2005, Sean Upshaw Brown, someone Cosby had attempted at having an affair with, stated that Cosby drugged and raped her the last time they were together. Brown's daughter, Autumn Jackson, also claims to be Cosby's daughter. She was convicted of extortion in 1997 after she threatened to make these claims public. In the early 1980s, Joan Tarshis told a reporter about her being assaulted by Cosby, but nothing came of it. During a 2005 interview, an anonymous woman came forward stating that in 1984, Cosby had drugged her, and she awoke with her clothing partially removed. In 1996, an interview was recorded with Victoria Valentino, where she made allegations against Cosby. The piece that the interview was conducted for was never published. In 2000, Lachelle Covington filed a criminal complaint of assault against Cosby. The complaint was referred to the DA, but they decided not to prosecute. In 2004, Andrea Constant accused Cosby of drugging and assaulting her. In 2005, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania District Attorney said that there wasn't enough evidence to go ahead with any charges. Constant filed a civil claim in 2005 with 13 potential witnesses, with one of those women coming forward earlier that year that Cosby had drugged and assaulted her in the 70s. Cosby settled the claim out of court. In 2006, Philadelphia Magazine published an article that gave a detailed account of Constant's allegations, as well as allegations from several other women. In October 2014, a part of Hannibal Burgess' comedy routine, Burgess addressed Cosby's public moralizing, mentioning Cosby's rape allegations. The joke hadn't had much of a response up to that point, despite Burgess having been using the joke for the past 6 months. But this performance led to a swarm of media attention around Cosby, and leading to many women coming forward with allegations. Cosby's legal team quickly denied the allegations. On the 26th of April 2018, Cosby was found guilty on 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault against Andrea Constand, and on the 25th of September 2018, he was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in state prison. On the 30th of June 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned Cosby's conviction, citing violation of his due process rights. Bill Cosby was released, having served nearly 3 years of his conviction. In 2022, Cosby had to pay $500,000 in damages as a result of a civil suit filed against him by Judy Hurth in 2014, alleging that he had assaulted her in 1975 when she was 16. Alright, now with that out of the way, The Cosby Show stars the Huxtable family, a black upper-middle-class family living in Brooklyn Heights, New York. The father, Cliff Huxtable, played by Bill Cosby, is an obstetrician, and the mother, Claire Huxtable, played by Felicia Rashad, is a lawyer. Although in the pilot they only have 4 children, in the rest of the show they have 5. Sandra, played by Sabrina LaBeouf, Denise, played by Lisa Bonet, Theo, played by Malcolm Jamal Warner, Vanessa, played by Tempest Belstow, and Rudy, played by Kesha Knight Pulmian. While the show sometimes involves serious subjects like dyslexia and teenage pregnancy, the show rarely mentioned issues of race more common on other sitcoms with mainly black casts. Still, the show does include references to the civil rights movement and frequently promoted African American and African culture. After overseeing successful sitcoms like Mork and Mindy and Three's Company, Marcy Carsey and Tom Werner decided to leave ABC and form their own production company. And for the first major project, they decided on creating a sitcom, and they needed a big name behind it. Bill Cosby had had a lot of success around film and television in the 60s and 70s, but by the early 80s, his career had begun to slow down. Carsey and Werner were both fans of Cosby's stand-up, and thought that his style would be perfect for family comedy. At first, Cosby wanted the couple to be working class, with the dad being a limo driver that owned his own car, and the mum being an electrician. But after the divorce of Cosby's wife, it was changed that they would be more well off. Despite Carsey and Werner's connection to ABC, the network passed on the show, leading to NBC picking up the show instead, and early episodes were filmed at NBC's Brooklyn studios. Whitney Houston was considered to play Denise, but was unable to commit to a full-time contract with NBC, as at the time she was intending to start her music career full-time. When the 5th child, Sandra, was being cast, Cosby originally wanted Vanessa Williams to play the part due to her college education and background in theatre. However, as she had recently been crowned Miss America, she wouldn't be able to play the role while representing the pageant. During the 3rd season, Rashad fell pregnant, but instead of writing this in, it was decided to film around the pregnancy, reducing her scenes and filming in the way that her pregnancy wasn't noticeable. Lisa Bonet would become pregnant during the course of the show and came close to being fired. The tensions were worsened by her appearing in the film Angel Heart, which included sexual scenes which Cosby strongly disapproved of. Bonet would eventually be fired in 1991. The Cosby Show would have an incredibly successful run, being the first in the ratings for 5 seasons in a row, from season 2 until season 6. The Cosby Show also won the Emmy for Best Comedy in season 2, the only show with a dominantly black cast to do so. The show was also incredibly successful financially, earning $1 billion from TV adverts and $1.5 billion from syndication, being pulled in 2014 due to the allegations against Cosby. Only Fools and Horses set around Derek Trotter, nicknamed Del Boy, a fly trader from South London that lives in the council flat where much of the show is set, along with his younger brother Rodney and the boy's granddad. Their mum Joan died when Rodney was young, and their dad Reg left soon after, leaving Del to become Rodney's surrogate father figure, and the relationship would be similar to that seen in Steptoe and Son. The plots of each episode were largely self-contained, especially towards the beginning of the show, but as the show developed, they would implement more serialized storylines like the boys' love life and the pair trying to become millionaires. Del, played by David Jason, is a quick-witted, smooth-talking South London market trader willing to sell anything and get his hands on. The characterization is matched by his cheap gold jewelry and camel coat. Del is incredibly devoted to his family, having taken care of Rodney and Grandad since he was 16. During the show's run, the main cast will be surrounded by a number of supporting characters. At first, this would be restricted to only a few, such as Del's mate Trigger, played by Roger Lloyd Pack, but as the show's scope, storylines, and locations would expand, as would the cast. And as the show progressed, series creator John Sullivan decided that he wanted to include more female characters and decided to do so through Del's love life. Raquel Turner, played by Tessa Peak Jones, first appeared during the 1988 Christmas special, and with this intending to be a one-off, but she would return a year later, and her and Del would begin the relationship. The pair would fall out, over her part-time job as a stripper. They would get back together, Raquel would move in, and they would have a son, Damien. Rodney, played by Nicholas Lyndhurst, is far more idealistic and socially awkward than Del, and is often frustrated by his dependence on Del and him being confined to being a sidekick. He does attempt to gain independence from Del, but is only partially successful in this when he's married to Cassandra during season 6. Grandad, played by Leonard Pierce, rarely leaves the Trotter flat, spending much of his time in his armchair in front of the 2 TV sets. Although absent-minded, he still does display a high level of intelligence. When Pierce died during the filming of an episode for season 4, it was decided to bring in an older family member to replace the character's role. Uncle Albert, played by Buster Merrifield, would join the cast during Grandad's funeral as Grandad's estranged younger brother, soon moving in, and his time in the Navy would become one of the show's long-running gags. But Merrifield himself would pass away in 1999, and Albert's death would be written into the next episode. When his show Citizen Smith came to an end in 1980, John Sullivan was looking for a new project and would pitch 2 sitcoms to the BBC, both of which would be rejected. Sullivan would draft a script based on these ideas, and through a friend at the BBC, he got the draft to the BBC's head of comedy, John Howard Davies, who would commission Sullivan to write a full series. The working title for the show was Reddy's, but the title for the show that Sullivan intended to use, Only Fools and Horses, was based on the genuine but obscure saying used in the show's theme song, Only Fools and Horses Work. But Only Fools and Horses had been the title of an episode of Citizen Smith, and Sullivan liked the expression and thought it would fit his new show. He was intentionally overruled about the title, but would eventually get his way. The show began filming in 1981 and was broadcast in September that year to an average response to both critics and audiences. The show's second series would fare slightly better. The first and second series would be put into reruns, where it would pick up high enough viewers to commission a third series. From then on, Only Fools and Horses would dominate ratings in the UK, but during the fourth season, Leonard Pierce would suffer a heart attack and pass away on the 15th of December 1984. It would be decided that recasting Grandad would be disrespectful to Pierce, so they instead decided on replacing Grandad with a separate character. During season 5, David Jason would tell Sullivan that he wanted to leave the show, so Sullivan wrote an episode where Del would accept an offer to start a business in Australia, and plans were made to write a spin-off with Rodney. Jason would then change his mind, and the ending of the episode would change to Del rejecting the offer. The scripts for the show Sullivan wrote tended to run too long, meaning that a lot of the material had to be cut, and for the 6th season, he and Jason requested that the length of the show would be increased from 30 minutes to 50, requiring a 40% increase in the show's budget. This would coincide with the show becoming one of the BBC's most popular programs. The 7th series would air in 1981, and this would be confirmed to be the show's final season. Still, the show would continue for 4 Christmas specials between 1991 and 1993, and there would be 3 more specials broadcast over Christmas 1996, intended to tie up the show. There would be 3 more Christmas specials between 2001 and 2003, and despite rumours of more episodes, these would be the last episodes and Sullivan would pass away in 2011. The show would only return for a sports relief episode in 2014. Our next show, which technically begins in the 80s and the majority of its run falls outside of the decade, was arguably at its best and most relevant in the 90s. The Simpsons follows the titular family and their lives in the fictional town of Springfield. Springfield acts as an average American town that shapes to the needs of the story. The show acts on a floating timeline with the characters not aging. Homer, played by Dan Castellaneta, is a careless buffoon whom everything seems to work out for. His personality conflicts with his job as a safety inspector at the town's nuclear power plant. Homer is prone to anger, but despite this, shows genuine care for his family. Homer's wife, Marge, played by Julie Kavner, is a stereotypical housewife and mother who acts as a grounding and sensible force for her family. Their son, Bart, played by Nancy Cartwright, is a 10-year-old prankster and troublemaker who, while often getting in trouble by himself, often gets into trouble through the peer pressure of the town's group of bullies. Bart's sister, Lisa, played by Yeardley Smith, is an 8-year-old activist and star student with dreams of going to a top university. She is also quite proficient at the saxophone. The family also includes a baby, Maggie, who communicates through sucking on a pacifier. Regardless, she sometimes is the focus of her own subplots and has a recurring relationship with another baby. The family has a dog, a greyhound, Santa's little helper, who was introduced in the show's Christmas episode in the first season, where he is abandoned by its owner after finishing last in the greyhound race and is then found by Homer and adopted by the family. The show also has a cat, Snowball 2, who replaced the original Snowball during the 15th season. The show also includes much of Springfield's population to make up the show's large supporting cast, as well as the Simpsons' extended family. The floating timeline of the show generally takes place during the year of the current season's release. The show also includes flashbacks and flash forwards depicting other moments in the characters' lives, with the date being relative to the current year. The only episodes outside of the main canon are the show's Halloween Treehouse of Horror episodes. While many of the changes in the show tend to revert to the norm by the end of the episode, some changes stick, like the divorce of Milhouse's parents and the deaths of Maud Flanders, Mona Simpson and Edna Crabapple. In the mid-80s, James L. Brooks was working on the variety show The Tracy Ullman Show and wanted to include animated sketches before and after commercial breaks. He would ask Matt Groening to pitch a series of shorts for the show, having liked his comic strip Life in Hell. Groening did initially pitch an animated version of Life in Hell, but in the lobby of Brooks' office, he realised it would mean losing the comic strip's publication rights. He decided to hurriedly come up with a new idea for an animated family sitcom, using the names of his family, substituting his own name for Bart. The Simpsons first appeared on The Tracy Ullman Show on the 19th of April, 1987, and in 1989, the show was adapted into a half-hour series, premiering on the 17th of December, 1989. The Simpsons is still currently ongoing with 35 seasons, and The Simpsons movie released in 2007. While The Simpsons' popularity has waned in the past couple of decades, it still holds a legacy as one of TV's most popular sitcoms, and is still continuing influence on popular culture. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air follows the titular Fresh Prince, Will Smith, who plays a fictionalised version of himself as he is forced to move from West Philadelphia to live with his wealthy aunt and uncle after his mum is frightened by Will's run-in with a gang. Will's uncle, Philip Banks, is played by James Avery, a self-made lawyer and former civil rights activist. Throughout the show, Uncle Phil is shown to be a stern but loving role model for Will, and by the end of the show ends up seeing Will as his own son. Vivian Banks, played by Janet Louise Hubert, for the first 3 seasons, and Daphne Etta Reed from then on, is Will's nurturing, career-minded aunt. Vivian has 3 sisters, one of them being Will's mum, and with which she is very close. Together, Vivian and Phil have 4 children, the last of which being born midway through the show. Carlton Banks, played by Alfonso Ribeiro, is the Banks' oldest son, and Will's preppy, politically conservative cousin, who acts as Will's main foil during the show, but eventually becomes Will's closest friend. Hilary Banks, played by Karen Parsons Rockwell, is the Banks' oldest daughter. She is mostly portrayed as an arrogant and shallow airhead obsessed with shopping and money. She also looks down on Will for his upbringing, but she is largely shown through an empathetic light and is shown to have a strong love for her family. Ashley Banks, played by Tatiana Ali, is the Banks' youngest daughter, who is far more sympathetic to Will than the rest of her family and greatly looks up to him. Will's influence on her as the show progressed led her to become far more rebellious, causing tension between Will and Uncle Phil, who disapproves of this rebellious behaviour and sees it as Will's fault. Will's youngest cousin, Nikki Banks, played by Ross Bagley from season 5 onwards, is born at the end of season 3. The Banks also have a British butler, Jeffrey Butler, played by Joseph Marcel, who, despite his cynical attitude and seeming disdain for them, deeply cares about the Banks family. In the late 80s, Will Smith became well known in Hollywood through his success in the music industry, but by the end of the decade, due to poor budgeting, he had nearly bankrupted himself. In 1989, Smith ran into Benny Medina, who pitched a TV show loosely based on his own life, which he had been shopping around, but Smith was reluctant due to his lack of acting experience. Medina invited Smith to a party at Quincy Jones's house, who he had been developing the idea for the show with. At the party, Jones challenged Smith to audition for NBC chief Brandon Tartikoff, and a contract for the show was drawn up later that night, and the pilot was shot 3 months later, airing on the 10th of September 1990. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air over its run was incredibly successful. Seinfeld follows the personal lives of Jerry Seinfeld and his close circle of friends. The show is generally set around Jerry's apartment in the Upper West Side of Manhattan and draws its comedy from the absurdity of day-to-day life. The show is interspersed with clips of Seinfeld stand-up, although the amount of clips used would decrease as the show went on. Jerry Seinfeld, playing a fictionalized version of himself, is generally the focus of each episode, usually acting as the everyman, poking fun at the chaos happening around him. George Costanza, played by Jason Alexander, is Jerry's best friend since high school and is loosely based on series co-creator Larry David. George is generally depicted as a loser, being insecure, jealous, and pedantic. He begins the show as a real estate agent, but spends most of the show's run unemployed. Still, George is reliable to his friends and has success in dating. Later on in the show, he ends up securing a job with the New York Yankees. Elaine Bennis, played by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, is Jerry's ex-girlfriend and another of his close friends. Elaine is generally depicted as smarter than the rest of her friends, and she begins the show as a publishing editor. Although she is friendly, she is sarcastic and quick to anger and frustration. Cosmo Kramer, played by Michael Richards, is Jerry's slacker neighbor and another of Jerry's close friends. Kramer is unemployed, although it's later revealed that he's been on strike. Kramer is generally depicted as an uneducated doofus, but is also one of the more redeemable redeemable out of the gang, being empathetic and helpful, with his charisma and laid-back personality making him successful with both women and employers. The parents of each of the friends are shown throughout the show, with the only exceptions being Elaine's unnamed mum and Kramer's unknown dad. As well as making fun of the characters and general situations taking place around the gang, the majority of the comedy is earned through the gang's negative character traits, getting into petty conflicts and involving themselves in other people's lives with the often disastrous results. This is kept up throughout the show, with the characters lacking any true character development, despite the show's serialized format. The show also lacks the pathos common with other shows, with the audience never being made to feel pity for any of the characters, allowing for even the worst of situations to be made fun of. Seinfeld also sets itself apart from many of the other shows at the time by refusing to allow a will-they won't-they relationship between Jerry and Elaine, despite them starting the show coming out of a relationship together. The pilot for Seinfeld, at that point called The Seinfeld Chronicles, created by Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David as a mix of Seinfeld's stand-up comedy and conversational scenes, mainly between Jerry and George. The pilot was screened for a group of NBC executives in early 1989, but didn't get quite as good a reaction as they might have been hoping for, and it was deemed to be too niche for widespread appeal. The reaction from test audiences was even worse, who were almost entirely put off by the conversational elements with Jerry and George. The Seinfeld Chronicles pilot would not be included for NBC's May primetime schedule in 1989, but would air on the 5th of July and would fare much better than expected, finishing second in its time slot. The ratings did not take the same New York skew that they had expected, and it was decided to cancel one of the network's Bob Hope comedy specials to make more funds available to order 4 episodes of Seinfeld, and this would make up the show's first season. Castle Rock, Seinfeld's production company, did shop around the show to other networks, but no one else would take the show, and it would return to the NBC on the 30th of May 1990. The show was first repeated on the 5th of July, and the ratings for the repeat were enough to secure a second season. It was also found that the show was popular with young male adults, an important demographic for advertisers, and this further incentivized NBC to keep broadcasting the show. Despite the show being set in New York, it was filmed at CBS Studio Center in LA, including the outdoor scenes set in New York, which were filmed on the studio's New York Street and Central Park backlots. The second series would be increased to 13 episodes. Larry David advised Seinfeld to reject the offer, believing that they had no more stories to tell, but Seinfeld accepted the offer regardless. Seinfeld's first few seasons, although not as popular with audiences as it would be later on, were still very popular with critics. Season 4 would be the 25th highest rated series in the country, the highest ranking season up to that point. This season would continue to be loved by critics this season and would be the first to win the Emmy for Best Comedy Series. This season would also include the episode The Contest, one of the most popular episodes across the entire show. The episode would win David the Emmy for Best Comedy Writing. Season 5 would be the 3rd ranked series in the US, and it would include more of the show's most popular episodes. This season would also include the beginning of many of the show's longer running storylines, such as George getting a job with the Yankees and Elaine leaving her job at Pendant Publishing. Season 6 would be the first season to be the #1 rated show in the US. Season 6 would also include Kramer's mum revealing that Kramer's first name is Cosmo, named after Cosmopolitan magazine. This season would also use far less of Seinfeld's stand-up throughout the show. In Season 7, the long-running story of George's relationship with Susan Ross would develop as they would get engaged, and George would spend most of the season regretting that engagement and trying to get out of it. George would end up getting his way, as Susan would die by the end of the season, being poisoned by toxic envelopes, which were only toxic because George would only buy the cheapest envelopes available. After Season 7, Larry David would leave the show, and Jerry Seinfeld would take over his responsibilities as showrunner for the final 2 seasons, resulting in the show being much faster paced, and the show would no longer include segments of Seinfeld's stand-up. Despite the enormous popularity of the show, the willingness of the cast, and a $5 million per episode offer from NBC, Seinfeld decided not to renew the show for a 10th season, and Season 9 would be its last. Season 9 would be the second season to be the top of the US ratings, and the finale would be the 4th highest watched series finale in US history, behind only MASH, Cheers, and The Fugitive. The series finale would be a 75-minute episode following a 45 retrospective clip show. The final episode would be the first episode since Season 7 to include opening and closing credit stand-up acts by Seinfeld. The episode itself received mixed reviews by both fans and critics, as the show seemed to take its time forming into a proper storyline. Seinfeld was one of the most popular shows in the world while it was on, and set itself apart from its contemporaries by refusing to conform to the conventions that dictated most popular shows at the time, and it continues to have a great influence on TV. Friends, set in New York, follows the day-to-day lives of a group of 6 friends through their 20s and early 30s. The series begins as Rachel Green, played by Jennifer Aniston, joins the group after nearly marrying dentist Barry Farber, played by Michael Whitfield, and moves in with Monica. In the first series, Rachel acts as a fish out of water as she struggles with adapting to living on her own after being dependent on her parents and fiance. Rachel also has an on-again, off-again relationship with Ross, which acts as the largest through line in the show's run. Monica Geller, played by Courtney Cox, is Rachel's roommate and acts as the mother hen of the group. Throughout the show, she is shown to be very competitive and a perfectionist, displaying stereotypical OCD behaviour. Phoebe Buffay, played by Lisa Kudrow, is a masseuse and a self-taught musician, acting as the designated weirdo of the group. Phoebe has an identical twin, Ursula, who she avoids and despises. As a child, Phoebe lived with her mum until her mum committed suicide by sticking her head in the oven, making Phoebe homeless. This is used as a long-running joke in the show. Ross Geller, played by David Trimmer, is Monica's geeky older brother. Ross has a PhD in paleontology and works at the American Museum of Natural History. Ross also has a son, Ben, by his ex-wife Carol, who leaves him after realising that she is a lesbian. Chandler Bing, played by Matthew Perry, works in an office job that he hates and is mostly known for his sarcasm and his strong relationship with Joey. Chandler's sarcasm is largely blamed on his relationship with his parents, his mum being an erotic novelist and his dad a gay cross-dressing Las Vegas star who was largely mocked by the show. Joey Tribbiani, played by Matt LeBlanc, is a womanizing but dim-witted and innocent struggling actor. While Joey is shown to be as witty as the rest of his friends in the first few episodes, he becomes more and more stupid as the show goes on, becoming almost an invalid by the end of the show. After their show Family Album was cancelled by CBS in 1993, David Crane and Marta Kaufman began working on 3 new TV pilots premiered the next year, one of which being what would become Friends. Although Cameron Crowe alleges that Friends was based on his film Singles, saying that Warner Brothers wanted him to turn the film into a TV show in 1992, but it was taken over by Crane and Kaufman after he refused. Crane and Kaufman, however, said that they based the idea on when they were living in New York and were unsure on their future. They brought the idea to Kevin Bright, who was an executive producer on their HBO show Dream On, and the team would title their project Insomnia Cafe and turn it into a 7-page treatment that they would then pitch to NBC at the end of 1993. The pitch came at a perfect time for the president of NBC Entertainment, Warren Littlefield, who was looking for a show set around a group of 20-somethings that would act as a surrogate family. Littlefield had been getting NBC to develop scripts in-house, but hadn't got anywhere. But when Kaufman, Crane and Bright pitched the show, he was impressed immediately. NBC would buy the show as a put pilot, and Crane and Kaufman would only take 3 days to write the renamed Friends Like Us pilot. As the show was known to be the most promising at NBC, the producers had their pick in terms of casting, with agents being desperate to get one of their clients on the show. By March, they had whittled down their choices to 3 or 4 for each part, who were asked to read in front of Warner Television. Apart from Trimmer, who was the first to be cast, as Crane and Kaufman wrote his character with him in mind, having worked with him previously. During the production of the pilot, NBC requested that the script be changed, so they had one major story with several minor ones, but the writers refused, wanting to have each of the stories of equal weight. Although NBC did force the writers to include an older character to give advice to the main group, but would relent after the storyline that was eventually written turned out poorly. Filming would begin in the summer of 1994 in front of a live studio audience. The first episode would be broadcast on the 22nd of September 1994. Friends, despite being set in the city, was never shot in New York, and filming outside was limited as much as possible. Friends had an incredibly successful run, being one of NBC's most successful shows, and although it had its fair share of criticism, it continues to be successful commercially, earning Warner Brothers about $1 billion each year from syndication. Father Ted follows 3 Irish Roman Catholic priests. Father Ted Crilly, played by Dermot Morgan, Father Dougal Maguire, played by Ardal O'Hanlon, and Father Jack Hackett, played by Frank Kelly, who live with their housekeeper Mrs. Doyle, played by Pauline McLynn, in the parochial house of Craggy Island, a fictional island located off the west coast of Ireland. The priests answer to Bishop Len Brennan, who banished them to the island as punishment for certain incidents in their pasts. Ted for alleged financial impropriety involving church funds resting in his account, Dougal for an event only referred to as the Black Rock Incident, and Jack for his alcoholism and womanizing. Much of the show revolves around the titular Father Ted with Father Maguire, his sidekick, as they get into embarrassing situations, often as a result of their own doing, taking particular inspiration from Seinfeld. Father Jack is mostly immobile due to his alcoholism, with the occasional shout of drink, feck or girls, and is largely treated as a toddler. In the late 80s, co-creator Arthur Matthews formed a U2 tribute band with Paul and Kieran Woodfall called the Joshua Trio. They began writing comedy sketches to accompany their act, and Matthews would incorporate his character, Father Ted, for a short-lived stand-up routine. In 1991, Matthews left his job at magazine Hot Press and moved into the home of Graham Linham, who he met at Hot Press. Over the next few years, they would work on ideas for TV shows while writing for various sketch shows. They would eventually come up with the idea for Father Ted, pitching it to Hat Trick Productions and Channel 4. 3 series and 1 Christmas special would be aired, and one day after filming wrapped, Dermot Morgan died of a heart attack. The series had already been planned to finish before Morgan's death, with Morgan saying that he didn't want to end up being typecast after the series' end. There were offers to recast Father Ted for a spin-off, but Linham and Matthews declined. Across the series' run, the show was met with critical acclaim, and is the most popular sitcom in Irish TV history. Thank you for getting to this part of the video. It would be greatly appreciated if you would subscribe if you haven't already. If you're watching this video in the days after its release, I'll have the last part out within a week or so. The next video will cover the 2000s, starting with The Office, through to the current day, ending with Abbott Elementary, and then I'll have a conclusion of the whole series. But again, thank you for watching, and I'll be here again in the next video.